story of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Hopefully almost everything I have to say this morning will sound familiar since you read the chapter on becoming a world power, which featured the Spanish-American War. And then I used that chapter to help explain how your strategy for best reading. So we've been over that chapter once here in class. And so today I'm telling you the story, the lecture of the Spanish-American War. And I'll probably add a few details and such. Look for my interpretation as to its causes and results, of course. Compare that to Maclay. That's college level work. The American nation had always been an expanding nation. From the very first moment when the first pilgrim put a foot on Plymouth Rock, Americans had been expanding from that point. They'd been moving west, ever west, in search of new lands. But until 1898, we had contented ourselves with the contiguous lands, the connected lands of North America. But even this expansion was devastating to the people that already lived here, the Native Americans. But in 1898, at the end of the 19th century, there was no more mainland to take. South of us, of course, was Mexico and North Canada, and we had extended ourselves all the way out to the Pacific coast. What about the Pacific Ocean? Should we just keep on going? There was no consensus, no agreement in America about that question. Some determined imperialists, expansionists, wanted to keep on going, to take islands in the Pacific and work our way across. But most Americans thought it best that we simply stay home now and mind our own business. So there's a difference of opinion about what to do. Then came a war with Spain that created new circumstances. Part by accident, part by design, these new circumstances settled the question for a while about expansion in favor of the imperialists, those who wanted to keep on going. Ironically, our war with Spain and our subsequent imperialism came about largely because of our outrage over Spanish imperialism. The dispute with Spain. Cuba, about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was a Spanish colony. Had been for centuries. And the Spaniards were notorious for treating their colonies poorly. The Cubans had on several occasions rebelled in an attempt to throw off the yoke of Spanish rule, but always failed. A revolution broke out again in 1895, just a few years before the Spanish-American War. Now, the Americans almost always were sympathetic to rebels. Were we not rebels ourselves during the Revolution, right? Trying to throw off the yoke of the imperial oppressor, in our case, Great Britain. So we were naturally sympathetic to the underdog, the Cubans. And then the Cuban revolutionaries organized an effective propaganda campaign in the United States to obtain our sympathy and possibly even our support in their effort against Spain. Helping the Cuban cause in America in 1896, the Spaniards sent a new general to put down the revolt in Cuba, a man by the name of Valeriano Weyler. And Weyler's great new idea was to gather up the Cuban people and put them in concentration camps so that they could not help the rebels amongst them, and the rebels could not hide in the population. And of course, this being a tropical climate and it being in the 1890s when medicine was not well advanced, you put people close together in an environment in which they don't have enough to eat, enough to drink, they have no medical supplies. What's going to happen? They're going to start dying. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, the list goes on and on. And so now the Cubans begin to die in these concentration camps by the hundreds. The American people were outraged as news of this comes to the United States. And their outrage was further inflamed when two great newspaper figures in American history started to compete with one another over inflammatory and, frankly, outrageous headlines in order to sell newspapers. Now, the situation in Cuba is horrible. You don't have to exaggerate. But you want to sell the most newspapers, right? You want the most eyeballs on the website, see? And so exaggeration, the yellow press, meaning exaggeration or outright lies, the yellow press is invented at this time. And the two dominant people in this regard were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They have competing newspapers, you see. And so they compete with one another to put out the most outlandish headlines. This in a day when there is no radio. Obviously, there's no television. So news comes by way of newspapers. They succeeded both in selling newspapers and whipping up a first-class war fever amongst the American people. And so don't fall for the argument that fake news was invented 4 years ago. It was not. And there was fake news, yellow journalism, well before we put a label on it here in 1898. Okay? Go back to the era of the Founding Fathers. And you have exaggerated stories and falsified stories at that time. And that's just American history. Well, we have then a clamor for war amongst the American people. And this war fever had nothing to do with acquiring new lands out in the Pacific. It was sentimental. Help the poor Cubans throw off the Spanish yoke. But a few determined men, and here Maclay is right, a few determined imperialists, expansionists, people in important positions in the government and in the forming of public opinion, they would take advantage of this war fever to acquire new lands, both in the Pacific Ocean and in the Caribbean Sea. William McKinley and the decision for war. In the 1896 presidential election, Republican William McKinley ran against Democrat William Jennings Bryan. And McKinley's going to win. But I want you to know who William Jennings Bryan was. It's rare in a losing election, a man who was never president, that the person would be so significant. But Bryan is significant. Not only does he lose this election, he loses in 1900 as well, and then he loses again in 1908. The perennial loser. But he's nominated 3 times by the Democratic Party. Why? That's why he's important. William Jennings Bryan. McKinley, during the campaign, mentioned the idea of taking Hawaii, kind of offhanded, building the Panama Canal so we could get our fleet from the East Coast to the West to the Pacific. And also he mentioned independence for Cuba. But the campaign was not about foreign policy. We're coming out of the worst depression in American history, economic decline in the mid-1890s. What are the American people worried about? Recovery in the economy, domestic issues here at home. Foreign policy is an afterthought. You see, Bryan wanted to solve the Great Depression by helping farmers. And the way to help farmers who are going bankrupt by the hundreds and thousands because of the Depression. The way to help farmers, Bryan argued, was to add silver to the gold supply, which was the background of money, the support for money. This view of money is completely different from your view of money. As far as we are concerned, if we got a paper dollar in our wallet, that's a dollar, right? and it's worth $1. That is not the way throughout most of world history human beings have regarded money. They would, 100 years ago, they would have looked at that paper dollar and essentially said it's worthless because it's only paper, unless it was backed by what? Yeah, silver or gold, but especially gold. Okay? But that meant you can have only so many dollars because there's only so much gold, right? You see? So if you're going to increase population, you've got to increase the gold supply, or that gold is going to make those dollars more and more expensive. And the average person is going to have a real hard time in that kind of an environment. That's what's been taking place in the late 19th century. Money's becoming more expensive. You see. Brian says we got to solve this problem. We got to add silver to the gold supply so that we can create more money, because we'll use silver now to back these dollars with silver. Okay? But what that meant was you would put a lot more dollars out there into the economic environment. Farmers loved this because they had a better chance then of making money, and then they would pay their loans back, you see, with these cheaper dollars. Who's going to hate that idea? Yeah, the bankers, the ones who load the money. The wealthy, because their money is going to be worth less, you see. I know it's complicated. Just trust me. Just believe everything I say. That would be the opposite of a college education, right? But in this case, it is really complicated. But you trust me about the basics here of this economic money issue, okay? Well, this is an enormously important campaign. Are the farmers and the people like them going to win? And is Brian going to be president? Or is McKinley and the old establishment going to win and save Western civilization? Yeah, that's the kind of hyperbole that was used. Right? If Brian wins, the economic situation will actually become worse. And grass will grow in our streets. It is, after all, a political campaign. Exaggeration, fake news. Well, McKinley wins. But the issue's not going to go away. Brian's not going to go away. 2 years later, in 1898, events in Cuba grew more alarming. And the newspaper is even more sensational, if that were possible. But you see, the President of the United States, William McKinley, has no intention of intervening in Cuba. He is not one of those avowed imperialists, okay? He does hope the Cubans will gain their independence, but the vast majority of Americans hope the same thing. Good luck. Not our problem. And then American businessmen, who are often blamed for this war by poor historians, they were opposed to the war. It's bad for business. They thought they would lose more than they might gain. So, American businessmen not impressed by the idea that if we take Cuba or other islands, we'll have more markets for our products. Yeah, not going there. No, we didn't go to war for business. Indeed, the true American imperialists, those who did want to take new places, were highly critical of both the president, who's not enough on board as far as they were concerned, and highly critical of businessmen who seemed to be too timid. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the imperialists. He is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Not the Secretary of the Navy, not the man in charge, but the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He does want war. He does want empire. He wants to make America a great nation. To take the next step in the American story, as Maclay says. And I mentioned the other day, this is the Darwinist, Spencerian, imperialist argument. Either nations are growing larger and more powerful, survival of the fittest, or they're the next lunch. And Maclay gives you a few other apostles of imperialism in that one nice page Alfred Thayer Mahan, Henry Cabot Lodge, etc., etc. Roosevelt privately declared that the President of the United States, McKinley, had, and I quote, no more backbone than a chocolate eclair. He's too timid, see? He doesn't get it. And he further said, Roosevelt, we will have this war for the freedom of Cuba in spite of the timidity of business people. But McKinley remained opposed. And he seeks a negotiated settlement with the Spaniards that would free Cuba. Okay? But Spain has no intention of giving up Cuba. They are infected with the same imperial idea that I've just mentioned, that you're either getting stronger and more powerful or you're the next victim. And again, this is where Darwin and Spencer lead, right? Truth be told. They get a pass on this, usually, in the press and in most college courses. McKinley now sent the United States battleship Maine to Havana Harbor in Cuba. Why? Well, to be a show of force, to show the Spaniards that we're serious, to show the Cubans we're serious. Leave American business people alone. Don't trifle with America. But it also says we're serious enough to the Spaniards to negotiate in good faith. We have a warship in Havana. Unfortunately, the Maine blew up, exploded, sunk to the bottom of the harbor. Over 250 American sailors dead. At the time, it appeared that the ship had struck a mine. Okay, who placed the mine? Who are the usual suspects? Spaniards. Maybe some intelligent people thought Cubans. Blow up the Maine. The Americans will blame it on the Spaniards. Now help us. In fact, the last people to probably place the mine and blow up the Maine were the Spaniards. They already had enough trouble. What really happened? Now here Maclay doesn't tell you. But subsequently, many years later, we learned that the boiler in the Maine spontaneously exploded. This was something that happened to boilers in those days. And unfortunately, the ship was poorly designed because the powder bin for the guns was right next to the boiler. The boiler explodes, the powder explodes, big hole in the ship, down she goes. That's what happened. Nobody did it. Engineering students, poor engineers, right? Yeah. Well, don't make that mistake. And if you were wondering, engineering students, why you were in this class, there was your moment. Right there. Take that one to the bank. But they didn't know that then. You had to blame somebody, right? Yeah. That's not going to be discovered for decades. So now you get the public clamor for war. It's too great for McKinley. He can't stop the wave. The cause of American entry into the war must be assigned to the American people then and their humanitarian concern for Cuba. Had that not existed, there's no way this war would have happened. The long-term cause of the war then was that humanitarian concern, and the Maine blowing up, that's just the trigger. Okay? That's the trigger for the war. And so now the American people demanded war to free the Cubans. And of course, Spain refused Cuban independence. But wars, even successful ones, and here this is a lesson, a message for everybody in this class. Even successful wars have unintended consequences. Unintended consequences. You can talk about the causes of the war and what the hopes were for the victorious people, but there are going to be unintended consequences as well. And some of those more important than the intended consequences. The Americans liberated Cuba. They did. They win it. And they may well have saved many Cuban lives. But they also tied themselves to the Western Pacific, the Far East, in the process. Unintended consequences. Maclay is right about this as well. The Spanish-American War. So this is the actual fighting of the war. This is less important than the causes and results of the war, but nevertheless, there's some interesting things here. On April 25th, 1898, the U.S. Congress declared war on Spain. I guarantee you that is not on the test. It's a date. Let's get the date right. Let's get the year right anyway, 1898. McKinley sent the Navy 2 places as war is declared. First to Santiago, Cuba, on the southern shore, to blockade the Spanish fleet there. Makes sense. War's about Cuba. Send part of the fleet to Cuba. But his imperial supporters in the Republican Party, Theodore Roosevelt chief amongst them, had arranged to have a part of the American fleet out in the Philippines, all the way across the Pacific Ocean at the Spanish colony of the Philippines. So it is a Spanish colony. And the fleet out there under Admiral Dewey has secret orders that if war is declared, that they are to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, issued the orders to Dewey one afternoon when the Secretary of the Navy was out of the office. Now, this does come to light. Even the President is aware of this after the fact. Do you then cancel the orders? He decided not to. But if it hadn't been for Theodore Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy is a very low position. They probably would not have sent the fleet to the Philippines. And so there we are. War is declared. Admiral Dewey does his job. He destroys the Spanish fleet. The American people had no idea that we were going to take the Philippines till after it was done. Unintended consequences. Meanwhile, an American army had to be created from frontier cavalry garrisons out west. We do not have much of a standing army on the East Coast. Almost all of the relatively small army we have is in those classic western forts out west watching the Native Americans. Yes, even in 1898. Even well after the events that you're watching in Geronimo. So if we're going to send an army to Cuba, that's where the army has to come from. You've got to bring those boys back to Florida and send them across to Cuba. Then, too, thousands of men volunteered to liberate Cuba. And the army clumsily expands and gathers in Florida. Theodore Roosevelt now resigned as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And in those days, you could do this if you were famous and wealthy, and Roosevelt was. He raises a regiment of his own. Yes. Almost 1,000 men, called the Rough Riders. Who were these Rough Riders? Famous in American legend. They're cowboys from out west. A lot of them were from the upper classes of America's Ivy League colleges, like Yale and Harvard and so forth, athletes, you know, on the football team, the rowing team and such. You say, oh, this is a great opportunity, right? Volunteered, became part of the Rough Riders. And there's a lot of old Western movies that'll show you a time when there's a judge out west in 1898 and there's a convict before him and he gives the convict a choice, 5 years in the federal penitentiary, or you can join the army and go to Cuba. Well, how would you do? I don't know about you, but I'd join the army and go to Cuba. A lot did. So you have convicts as part of the Rough Riders, you see. And Theodore Roosevelt is their executive officer, that is second in command. So, the Rough Riders. An invasion force of some 17,000 Americans then are gathered in Florida, including Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and they will eventually be shipped to Cuba once enough ships can be found to get the job done. Well, they had a hard time supplying these guys and finding enough ships, and so the Rough Riders, a cavalry regiment, are sent to Cuba without their horses. And now they're infantry. Except for the officers, of course. They get to keep their horses. And so the American Army lands near Santiago, Cuba, again in the south coast. The Spanish held the town and the hills nearby, Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. Everybody's heard probably of the Rough Riders charge up San Juan Hill. It is early July, 1898. The Americans launched an assault on the two hills. You control the hills, then you can put your artillery on the hills and shoot down into the town of Santiago. Whoever's down there has to give up. So take the hills, take Santiago. The Rough Riders were part of the force attacking Kettle Hill. The Americans, of course, inexperienced, poorly organized. Moreover, the Spanish held the high ground on both hills. And they knew as long as they held those hills that they controlled the town. And so they knew also that in order to take those hills, you had to come up certain ravines and passageways and so forth. And so the Spanish on those hills, they trained their guns on those passageways. Pre-sighted for range and direction. Roosevelt's regiment was placed behind the 9th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Armed Forces. The 9th, a little bit up on the hill in front of Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And the 9th had been withdrawn from Western outposts and brought to fight in Cuba. These are the famous Buffalo Soldiers. 9th Regiment is a regiment of black soldiers, black Americans. Nobody knows exactly why they're called Buffalo Soldiers. There's lots of theories, but that meant black soldiers. Note that we have black soldiers in 1898. We had black soldiers during the Civil War in the last 2 years of it. And we will have some black soldiers during World War I. But in World War II, we will have virtually zero black soldiers. Blacks will not be allowed to fight except for some very rare exceptions. During World War II, there are going to be truck drivers and mechanics and cooks and so forth, but not allowed to fight. So here's one of those stories of American racism becoming worse and worse and worse in the 20th century. Not getting better. No progress towards equality during that time. Part of the story of American history. But here's the 9th. They're ready to fight. They're going to take Kettle Hill. And Roosevelt's regiment right behind them. Now the Spanish opened up with their guns on those pre-sighted places. But there was chaos at American headquarters, and so the order to go ahead and begin the assault, which was to be coordinated on both hills, timed out properly, doesn't come. And so the Americans are sitting there taking this shelling, and men are dying, and nothing's happening as far as the Americans are concerned. Roosevelt is riding his horse back and forth. He's anxious. He wants to get the orders to charge. Finally, he decides that on his own authority, he's going to give his boys the order to charge. And so he does. Follow me. And he begins to ride his horse up the hill. And so then the Rough Riders get up and they begin to walk. Every few yards, they would stop and they would fire up onto the hill. You'd stop, you'd kneel on the hillside and fire, and then reload and walk a few more yards and then kneel and fire again. But eventually they got to the Buffalo Soldiers, who had really been taking a pounding. And Roosevelt tried to persuade the Buffalo Soldiers then to follow him and his boys. But the commanding officer of the Buffalo Soldiers won't do it. He hasn't received the order to charge. Roosevelt says, then get out of the way as we're coming through your lines. And then some of the junior officers of the Buffalo Soldiers said to their men, in spite of their commanding officer, "Follow Colonel Roosevelt." And so here come the white boys and the Rough Riders. And they're coming now through the Buffalo Soldiers, and the black soldiers in blue, they get up and they begin to intermingle. And these two regiments now come up the hill. Again, every once in a while they would kneel and fire and then get up again and march. And the boys in blue were falling left and right, and still these white and black soldiers kept coming. Roosevelt gets off his horse now. Ground's too tough. And he's leading the charge up Kettle Hill. Finally, he and a handful of these soldiers, they crest the hill, and Roosevelt has his pistol, and he fires into the trenches, and the other soldiers now with him, and they've taken Kettle Hill. What Spaniards are left in disarray, throwing up their hands. And now the two regiments forming on top of Kettle Hill, and Roosevelt says, "Follow me!" Because he saw that over on San Juan Hill, that hill had not been taken yet. They could use some help. And so Roosevelt now rushes down Kettle Hill, and as he's running down the hill, he notices that there's a lot of bullets plinking right around him. And he's wondering just really quickly in his mind, why are these guys focused on me? And he looks around and he realizes he's all alone. Nobody had heard him say in the chaos and tumult of taking Kettle Hill, "Follow me." So now he runs back up Kettle Hill. He says, "Boys, follow me." Now they see him. "Follow Colonel Roosevelt." And so now the whole regiment's come down the hill. And then up San Juan Hill. And San Juan Hill is taken as well. Who's the hero of the American victory in the Spanish-American War? Theodore Roosevelt, and rightfully so. He has this philosophy of the strenuous life, the virtuous life, he would call it. He's not a hypocrite. He believes in American expansionism and American imperialism, and he leads in combat in the same way. So, Theodore Roosevelt does many things, some of them not admirable. But he puts his blood where his mouth is, anyway. The war was over by fall. Results of the war. Cuba was liberated. No surprise. Spaniards are gone. And Puerto Rico, which is what was also a Spanish colony, was also liberated. Perhaps you're aware of the fact that Puerto Rico still belongs to the United States. Guam, out in the far Pacific, is also taken and becomes an American possession. But by far the most important of the possessions now to fall to the United States as a result of the Spanish-American War was the Philippine Islands, that are situated just off the coast of Asia, all the way across the Pacific from San Francisco. Several thousand islands make up the Philippines, and they are just south of the islands of Japan. Now, I don't want you to write down that Cuba was taken. It's taken from the Spaniards, but it's liberated. The Cubans are fairly free. The Teller Amendment, which Congress had passed at the beginning of the war, declared that the United States would not annex Cuba. American people did not go to war to take Cuba as the next state. The Platt Amendment of 1901, however, following quickly on the Teller Amendment, asserted American protection, there's a dangerous word, over Cuba. So the Americans are going to have some say in the affairs of Cuba, but we do not own Cuba. And then that amendment as well provided the United States with a naval base on the south side of Cuba, not far from Santiago, called Guantanamo Bay. And here we are 122 years later, and Guantanamo Bay still belongs to the United States. Guantanamo Bay was where the United States could keep an eye on the Caribbean. One of the places. In the Philippines, very fascinating history. After the defeat of the Spanish fleet, the Americans are received by the Filipinos as heroes, as liberators. Yankee Doodle. Thomas Jefferson. But after a major debate in the United States as to what to do about the Philippines, the United States decided to stay in the Philippines as the imperial power. Once this was decided, the Filipinos realized that their hopes of freedom had been quashed. This is not Cuba. Here, the United States is simply taking the position of Spain as the colonial power, the imperial power. And so now a Filipino rebellion breaks out. The Filipinos are going to fight the Americans for their freedom. From 1899 to 1902, about 3+ years, the United States fights a nasty war in the Philippines to suppress this Filipino rebellion. But they do win, they being the United States. With that victory in the Philippines, no one could deny that the United States had begun to chart a new course in our history in the world as an imperial power. We have become an empire. We have expanded across the Pacific, you see. And so the American people were still moving west. Meanwhile, the debate in the United States over the next 3 decades will go on. Sometimes the imperialists were winning the argument. Sometimes the anti-imperialists were winning the argument. But even when that happened, no one could really figure out what to do with the Philippines. If we're going to let them go free, how do we do that? If we're going to stay as the imperial power, what should we do then? We just kind of held on to it, not really knowing what to do. And so the Philippines remained an isolated American outpost in the Far East. It was both a springboard to China and other parts of the Far East, but potentially it was also a target by another Far Eastern aggressive power. And if another Far Eastern aggressive power rises and sees the Americans out there in the far Pacific, one of the first things they would have to do would be to remove that American threat. Obviously, there's more to this story coming in the next few weeks. Questions? Yes?
Sorry, I must have missed the Teller Amendment.
What's the Teller Amendment? That's right. The Teller Amendment is that the United States will not annex Cuba. Does that mean that we're not going to have anything to do with Cuba? No. The Platt Amendment says we're going to kind of keep a big brother's eye on the Cubans, and we get Guantanamo Bay, right? Okay. Yes.
Was Guam also a Spanish colony?
Yes. Guam was a Spanish colony. Anybody else? Yes.
Why did he take Guam in the Philippines and not?
Okay, so Hawaii is a separate case because American business people and missionaries have been in Hawaii for a very long time, a good part of the 19th century. And so Hawaii, as far as the whites there were concerned, was already moving towards becoming an American possession. The islanders have a completely different view of it, but it's the whites there who are going to control Hawaii. Okay. Anybody else? God bless you all. See you Thursday.